Just over 30 years ago, the Bay Area was rocked by the Loma Prieta earthquake. Measuring at 6.9 on the Richter scale, the quake caused damage in all regions of the Bay, changing it forever. Hi, this is Sam Lubman, producer of the Mark Guzman Experience, here to share with you the stories of that day, told to you by several of your neighbors here in the area. Some of the names you may know, others you may not, but each is connected by that one moment at 5:04 p.m. on October 17th, 1989. Jeff Rubin, president of the Pinole Historical Society, tells the story of how the earthquake impacted the city of Pinole, as well as his own personal story at Game 3 of the World Series between the Giants and the A's at Candlestick Park.
Well, two of the most historic buildings in Pinole were damaged during the Loma Prieta earthquake and were eventually torn down. And other than those two buildings, pretty much there was no damage in the city. I remember getting home from the Giants-A's game that night, and the only thing that was amiss in my house is I had a wooden statue on my fireplace that was not very secure anyway, and it was toppled over. But other than that, I mean, there was nothing in my home, nothing on my street. I didn't see any rubble in the city. But these two historic buildings, one of them was the old roof building, and that's R-U-F-F, pronounced roof, built by Lewis Roof in 1914, and it was a grocery store. And it also housed the telephone central and the fire alarm system. And of course, in those days, you didn't have phone numbers. So when you wanted to call somebody, you cranked up the phone and you got an operator who was sitting upstairs in Louis Roof's grocery store. And, you said, Mabel, connect me with so-and-so. And that's how you had a telephone conversation. And that building was damaged, and that's on the corner of San Pablo Avenue and Fernandez. And it's a brick building, and it was later Bill's Liquor. And it was torn down, and the Pear Street Bistro was built on that site. Now, there were three important structures on that street between Tennant Avenue and Fernandez. The middle building was the Bank of Pinole building, and that was not damaged, and that building is still standing. And but to the south of that building was another brick building, and also dating back to the turn of the last century. And back in the day, that was Greenstein's Pharmacy. And upstairs from Greenstein's Pharmacy was Dr. Manuel Fernandez's offices. And those offices were there, for a very, very long time, at least until he died. And that was in the early 1950s. And that building was a variety of things after it was a pharmacy. And there was office space both upstairs and downstairs. And that building was also damaged, and subsequently that building was torn down along with the roof building. So what that created was a giant empty lot on that street, and right in the middle of that lot was the Bank of Pinole building. What's most interesting about that is that outside of the Pear Street Bistro, that's pretty much what's there now. There are just to the south of the bank building, there are two parcels. One is a smaller parcel, and it's privately owned, and the other one on the corner is where a gas station used to be. And that building, the gas station left a long time ago, and that's now called the Community Corner. And really, it's an empty lot that's decorated with a walking path and rocks and, something to spruce it up. That plot of land plus the bank building were purchased with redevelopment funds. Well, when redevelopment was taken away 10 years ago by Governor Brown, all cities in California that had redevelopment, had property that was purchased with redevelopment funds were required to sell those properties. So what's happening now, and you know, this is 30 years after the Loma Prieta earthquake, is that the Bank of Pinole building and that piece of land on the corner are both for sale, and the city is marketing that, and we don't know what's going to happen to that property. But so there you have it. That's the result of the Loma Prieta earthquake and on the city of Pinole. And unfortunately, two buildings with a lot of history in this city were damaged and were subsequently torn down.
What about your own personal story from that day? What do you remember?
Well, you know, I'm a big Giants fan and a season ticket holder, and the Giants got clobbered in the first two games of the World Series, which were held in Oakland, and the middle three games were going to be held at Candlestick Park in San Francisco. It was a beautiful day. It was going to be a night game. I think it was going to start around, 5:15, 5:20, something like that. Capacity crowd, 60-something thousand people in the ballpark. And shortly after 5 o'clock, so I'm sitting on the first base side in section 19 in the lower reserve. So the upper deck is above me, okay? So I'm not out in the open. I'm probably about, 35, 40 rows up from the field behind first base. And shortly after 5 o'clock, we hear a rumbling noise. It was as if you were standing next to a train track and a freight train went by, and it just kept getting louder and louder and louder. And then I look up, and all the lights on the scoreboard, the electric lights, you know, this is before LED, so everything on the scoreboard, you know, they were all little bulbs, and they're all exploding. The whole scoreboard is exploding. And then I see the pole in front of me, and you know, Candlestick was built in the days when they had poles supporting the upper deck, and there was a pole in front of me to my right, didn't block my vision, but it was visible, and the upper deck starts moving, and I see the pole. The pole is swaying back and forth. The upper deck is swaying back and forth. And then I probably did the dumbest thing I've ever done in my life. You know, when I was a kid growing up in New York, and I'm sure they had the same thing out here, kids in school were taught to duck and cover in case of a nuclear attack. And what you did was you got on the floor and you kneeled down and you got under your desk seat, as if that's going to protect you. And so here I am. The upper deck is swaying. God knows how many tons that thing weighs. And I kneel down and I get below my plastic seat, a plastic seat, as if that's going to protect me. And of course, after 4 or 5 seconds, I'm thinking, what am I doing? And then I got up, and then the next thing you know, the players are on the field with their families, and nobody knows what's going on. We all knew it was an earthquake. We didn't know what the damage, and then somebody with a TV set very close to where I am is showing a helicopter view, one of the news organizations flying over the Bay Bridge, and you can see part of the Bay Bridge has collapsed. And then maybe 15, 20 minutes later, there's an aftershock, and the upper deck starts moving again. And after that second aftershock, they canceled the game. What was remarkable, what happened next is, picture this: you have more than 60,000 people in a ballpark. There's just been an earthquake. There's no electricity. It's getting dark because by that time it's probably around 5:45, close to 6 o'clock. They evacuate the ballpark, and everybody is moving just as if the game had ended. There's no commotion. Nobody's stampeding outside. Everybody is leaving orderly. It was the most orderly evacuation I've ever been a part of. Well, by the time I get to my car, it's pitch black. And of course, there's no electricity in the city. So you can't go home over the Bay Bridge. So I knew I'd have to go home through Marin. So I made my way out to 19th Avenue so I could get onto the Golden Gate Bridge. And all along 19th Avenue, there's rubble on the side. Frightening to see. Once I got over the Golden Gate Bridge in Marin, there was electricity. And I'll tell you, once you got to Marin, you wouldn't have even known there was an earthquake. It was as if it only happened in San Francisco. And so subsequently the ballpark was deemed there was no damage to the structure, and I think there were 6 days between games 2 and 3. And they resumed the World Series, and the A's won the next 2 games, and that was it.
Kim Vestal, who currently is the KCBS afternoon traffic reporter, was sitting down with her husband to watch Game 3 of the World Series at her home in the Santa Cruz Mountains, just a few miles from the epicenter of the Loma Prieta earthquake, when the shaking began.
I was 31, my husband was 33, we were newlyweds, and we were living in our first home we bought in the Santa Cruz Mountains, which, as the crow flies, was probably about 15 miles from the epicenter of the earthquake, which is in Loma Prieta, in the forest of Nicene Marks is where the epicenter was. So we weren't very far away. And the house that we lived in was super old. It was built in 1932. We lived in a neighborhood in the Santa Cruz Mountains surrounded by redwoods. So it's really foresty and hilly. A lot of homes in our particular neighborhood originally started out as cabins. Some of them were really old and ramshackle. Ours was a pretty good find, pretty good shape. So we've only been in the house for a little over a year, and we were just sitting down to watch the World Series. My husband is a huge Giants fan, and because I married him, I became one as well. And we had just sat down to watch the game. And all of a sudden, and I think he was in the living room with the TV on. I had just gotten up to go to the bathroom, and that's when the earthquake hit, like 5:05 or 5:06, I think the time was. And we both, we're from California. We felt earthquakes before. For in the first few seconds, it was like, oh, earthquake. And then it started shaking harder, and it kept going, and it kept going. And things started flying off the walls and the shelves and books. And they weren't just dropping, they were flying across the room. I ducked out of the bathroom and ducked into a bedroom. And I looked for, it was like instinctive. I looked for a place to cover myself because I just knew something bigger than your usual earthquake was going on. And I shoved myself under the bed in that bedroom, and there were bookshelves in there. And like I said, literally flying across the room, like in a horror movie. And I was thinking about my face and my head. I was like, oh my gosh, you could really get hurt. So while I was doing that, my husband was duck and cover in the living room right around the hallway corner there. And I can't tell you how long it shook. It's been 30 years, but by far it was the longest shaking ever. And I thought the house was going to start falling down, but it didn't. Um, and once it stopped, then we got up and we both met each other in the living room, just shocked, deer in the headlights. One of the first things we noticed was my husband had opened a can of root beer, and the root beer had somehow flown from the coffee table across the room and landed right side up without spilling. Isn't that crazy? And then, of course, we didn't have cameras back then. Now I was taking pictures. I did have a Kodak disposable camera, so we walked around the house and took pictures of the damage. We had a beautiful River Rock fireplace, huge fissures, huge cracks. It was destroyed. It had to be torn down. Every window in the house, we still live in the house, has been a little crooked ever since. And a few of the cabins in our neighborhood fell down. We didn't have power for about 2 days. We didn't have water for 2 weeks. We had to shower at friends' houses. We couldn't drive because we live off 17, and most of the roads here, Old Santa Cruz Highway, Highway 17, Summit Road, had huge cracks and fissures and weren't passable. So there were days and days and days of recovery. It was something to live through.
Chris DiBenedetti, sports columnist for the East Bay Express, recalls his trip home from college during the World Series when the earthquake hit, as well as the real-world consequences that so famously postponed baseball's biggest stage for 10 days.
Yeah, I was going to college in San Diego at the time. I was a sophomore or a junior in college, and I came home for the World Series. We had season tickets for the A's, and so we got playoff tickets, as we did really for all those years in 88, 89, 90, and 92 when the A's made the playoffs. So we had World Series tickets, and we went to games 1 and 2. We sat in the bleachers. The A's beat the Giants pretty handily in both games. And then the night before Game 3, so this would have been October 16th, I was in town, so we went to dinner with my cousins in San Francisco. And they were, they're big Giants fans, so it was kind of fun to get together with them and talk about the World Series. My parents live in Sonoma County, so we made the drive both times for games 1 and 2 over that Nimitz Freeway, as they called it at the time, on 880 to get to the Coliseum. So Game 3 starts, or at least the broadcast does anyway, sort of the pregame show on, I think it was October 17th. And I think it was ABC was doing the game, and it was Al Michaels and Tim McCarver, and they were kind of reviewing games 1 and 2 on television. I'm in the living room at my parents' house in Sonoma County, watching the game, watching this pregame show, and watching with my brother and my sister and my dad. And all of a sudden, the TV doesn't go blank, but it gets like that kind of snow, that kind of silver snow that TV used to have at 3 a.m. when they went off the air in the old days. So it's probably like some technical difficulties. And then all of a sudden, we could feel the rumbling. And it was really like a wave. Like, I don't know if you've ever cleaned out like a big carpet, but you kind of like, you pick it up from the end and you shake it, and then there's sort of like a wave that goes through your carpet that kind of flicks the dust off of it. You do it a couple times, and you clean your carpet. That's what it felt like. It felt like the ground was moving in waves up and down underneath us, and my parents' house started to shake, and we all we could do was just kind of walk gingerly towards the door jamb as the house was sort of thundering and moving back and forth and shaking. I don't know what they say. Go to a door jamb or under a table. So we went to a door jamb, underneath kind of the top of a door when the doors open. And it lasted for a long time. It lasted long enough. I'm not sure if it was 30 seconds, but it felt like that. And that was, if you've ever been in an earthquake, that was plenty long. I was in 5 years later. I was living in Los Angeles, and I was in the Northridge quake. That was a different quake. that felt like a giant or like a thunderbolt or like lightning hit my apartment and just shook it so that I could like literally. It just felt like it was, I guess they call it a shaker. The Loma Prieta one, by the time I felt it in Sonoma County, felt like a roller, and that was like the ground was rolling underneath you. It's a little less jarring, but it's just as scary. And so then we go back to the television and we're thinking, okay, well, that's over with. We're okay. Everyone's okay. And then we go back to watch the TV and thinking that, maybe they'll play the game. But within a couple minutes, it was clear they weren't going to play the game. They when ABC brought its broadcast back, there was a lot of chaos, and it was clear that the players were already starting to kind of assemble on the field. Eventually, they would tell us that players were leaving. I still remember Terry Steinbach's wife. I think it was a photo in Sports Illustrated, but you could see, I think during the broadcast, that she was pretty shaken up, and she was crying, and they made it very clear that there would be no game that night. And then as it got dark, because it was like a 5:30 p.m. start, so it's still twilight out in California right at that time. In a couple hours, it got dark, and at that point, you could see that there were blackouts in San Francisco. And Al Michaels I think he won an Emmy for his sort of impromptu coverage. He used to live in San Francisco in the Bay Area when he was briefly the Giants announcer in the 70s. So he could talk with authority and knowledge about, certain neighborhoods in San Francisco when they had the overhead camera. It was pretty crazy. And one thing that really, you knew it was a very serious earthquake when within minutes they reported that, and it was a bit of an exaggeration. Well, actually, it's a very big exaggeration. But the first phrase that you heard on television was that the Bay Bridge had collapsed. Now, when you hear that phrase, the Bay Bridge has collapsed, you think, did the entire bridge collapse? From that toll booth in Oakland through Treasure Island and then all the way to South of Market in San Francisco. Now, of course, that's not what happened. What happened was that one part, I think, of the upper level fell down. And unfortunately, I think someone died when their car didn't see the fallen part of the bridge, and they just kind of drove off of it and then nosedived into the lower level of the Bay Bridge. So eventually that came out that the Bay Bridge didn't really in fact collapse, but part of it did, and that there wouldn't be any traffic on it for several days. And then the big news came eventually through the night that that same freeway, it might be, it's the one that went through West Oakland, and I believe it was the Cypress. I'm sorry, I called it the Nimitz earlier. It was the Cypress Mandela portion of the 880. That had collapsed. The top part had fallen on the bottom part, and that there were motorists. Some people were still alive and trapped underneath, unfortunately. So that's really what happened. I remember seeing the Chronicle the next day, and it's framed, I think, in the Vesuvio bar in North Beach. It says hundreds dead. The next day, the Chronicle somehow, even without energy, got out a type of newspaper. And newspapers, sometimes they call it the Daily Miracle, because it's kind of a miracle that it all goes out every day with very few errors. Well, that day it really was a miracle that a daily newspaper got out in that area under those conditions. But the headline does not hold up well over time. It says hundreds dead. In reality, I think it was 47 people died, which is horrific, but far less loss of life than originally thought. And the majority of those deaths, sadly, happened. I think they were a part of the Cypress freeway collapsing there in West Oakland. As the days unfolded, the baseball stuff continued to really the World Series and the fact that this baseball stuff was happening in the backyard of this tragedy, this natural disaster that made international news. Those things continue to be intertwined. Dave Stewart, there were photos of him who went down to the Cypress freeway collapse scene and was helping out, I think, Oakland firefighters in his uniform, in his age uniform, when he left the when he got back to Oakland from Candlestick Park that night with the other players, he went all the way to Oakland. He went all the way to the Cypress Freeway scene and helped out with the first responders as best he could, talking about how this was his city and he was going to do everything he could to help out with those who were suffering. Stewart, not coincidentally, the way that this all affected the World Series, of course, the A's were up 2-0. And then, this whole thing was so unprecedented in the sports world. There'd never been an NBA Finals interrupted because of a national or a natural disaster, and there's certainly never been a Super Bowl or an NHL Finals. This was unprecedented that you first of all, that the A's and the Giants would actually make it to the World Series in the same year. That was amazing. And then to have that once-in-a-lifetime experience interrupted by a once-in-a-lifetime tragedy, it was really kind of unbelievable. And it kind of compounded the darkness surrounding it all. As the days went on, people debated, should they even have the World Series? Should they cancel it? I mean, that was a serious debate. I think Bob Podecki, the Santa Rosa Press Democrat columnist, argued in favor of that because, they had to now inspect Candlestick Park, which at the time was, what was it? It was about almost 30 years old and had always been sort of maligned. With Candlestick Park, which survived certainly the ground shaking, would that be safe to play a Game 3, Game 4, and perhaps a Game 6 if it went that long? Would the Coliseum be safe to play? So they had to inspect those things. And Fay Vincent, the commissioner of baseball, had to make those decisions, and he had to meet with the Giants owners, Bob Lurie, and the A's owners, Walter Haas Jr., and he had to meet with the mayors of those cities and of Oakland and San Francisco, and he had to meet with the city council members and the people, the inspectors, the directors of public works, people who make those kinds of decisions. So and then as those decisions were being made and discussed, it started to rain in the Bay Area. So it couldn't get more gloomy. You have a World Series that's teetering on being canceled. You have bodies that are being pulled out of the tragic collapse scene that had become sort of the symbol of the earthquake there in West Oakland with the collapsing freeway. And you've got this rainstorm that now is just kind of blanketing the Bay Area in gray skies and the very unbaseball-like kind of weather. Well, of course, they did wait it out. They did decide to finish it. People argued that finishing it and bringing baseball back would, give people a diversion and something to look forward to. So I think they waited 10 days, and I believe it might have been October 27th, or somewhere about those days. It was 10 days later after the Loma Prieta earthquake. They resumed the World Series. They played Games 3 and 4 at Candlestick Park, and the A's won those games as well, and completed the 4-game sweep of the A's defeating the Giants. The one thing that made it different was that the A's, Dave Stewart was such a money pitcher, and that he pitched Game 1, and he would have probably pitched Game 5, but had there been one. But because of the 10-day delay, he had several days off. So they pitched him again, and he dominated again, Game 3. Some people questioned that. They thought, well, maybe, because you wouldn't be doing this if it were not for the earthquake, that you shouldn't do it, that you should pitch Bob Welch, who was going to be your Game 3 pitcher. But Tony La Russa, who was the A's manager at the time and is as coldly analytical as they come, he made the decision to go with Dave Stewart. Again, in Game 3, Stewart went 21-9 that year with a 3.32 ERA. He had 8 complete games, 257 innings pitched, which these are things, 8 complete games and 257 innings. You just don't see those numbers anymore. He was the rock and the ace of that team, so he pitched Games 1 and 3. He won them. Mike Moore, who also had a great year, in some ways a better year, he had a 2.61 ERA and 3 shutouts and 6 complete games that year. He pitched Games 2 and 4 and the A's won both of those games as well. Bob Welch and Storm Davis, who would have pitched games 3 and 4, and they had good seasons themselves that year. Welch won 17 games, had a 3 ERA. Storm Davis had 19 wins that year, but they did not pitch games 3 and 4. So the A's swept the Giants, and they celebrated, but I don't think they had alcohol in the locker room. It was a muted celebration in the locker room anyway, because they wanted to be respectful of the fact that there had been a large loss of life and this headline grabbing national tragedy. And they did not have a parade for the same reasons. They did not want to be parading through downtown Oakland, a short walk from where there was this freeway collapse where dozens of people died, and I'm not sure if bodies were still there, but it was still a very raw and visible scene. So that's what happened. We have, my own personal experience is that I got tired of the rain, and I got tired of I was in college at the time, so I was missing school, and so I went back to San Diego, and I was back in San Diego when games 3 and 4 were finally played, and it definitely interrupted, things the earthquake did, but with the loss of life, it was hard for me to complain.
Dwayne Bartels was in the process of visiting a property in Crockett that he was listing to evaluate how it might hold up in the event of an earthquake. He got quite a way to test it.
Hi, on the date of the Loma Prieta earthquake, I was at a listing appointment in Crockett, and an old house, and turned out it had a brick foundation. So during the process of talking to the owners, I was talking to them about, well, that's something that, of course, needs to be disclosed to a buyer, and that it was kind of interesting, but it lasted a long, long time since the house was like 100 years old. But if my concern was if there was an earthquake, that it might become an issue. And as I was leaving, walking out the front door, Loma Prieta earthquake hit. It was like, I couldn't believe this. And so I grabbed onto a light pole to keep from getting shaken off my feet. And I had parked my car down underneath the Cardenas Bridge. And I thought, well, I'm not going down there. So I looked down there, and I could see the light standards on top of the bridge whipping back and forth 10 to 15 feet. And I thought, surely some of them were going to snap and go flying, but they didn't. So once things quit rocking and rolling, I went down, and nothing hit my car, and so I was good. And so I got and drove back to my home in El Sobrante at the time. And then and within a few minutes after arrival there, my son had sold his car and bought a motorcycle. And he related his experience, which he had bought it down in Oakland, and he was coming back, and the section of the freeway that collapsed there, he'd gotten through that and just got to the Caldecott Tunnel when the earthquake hit. And so it was kind of freaky for him. He got through the tunnel okay and off to the side of the road until the quake settled down, and then he drove on down San Pablo Dam Road to our home in El Sobrante, and he was shaken up, but okay. So that's what happened on that day.
KCBS Traffic's own Frank Munich was leaving SF State listening to music on the radio via a device called a Walkman when suddenly the music stopped and something much bigger began.
So I was at San Francisco State University. I was just coming out of a radio news writing class. And I put on my Sony Walkman, and if you don't know what one is, look it up on Google. I was listening to a radio station and walking back to a parking lot. And I felt shaking about as strong as I have ever felt. It almost knocked me off my feet. And I was looking around at the windows of the nearby buildings and saw them rattle. And just at that point, as the shaking really reached its peak, everything went quiet in my headphones. There was just absolutely nothing. I'd been listening to music and just absolutely dead. And I thought, well, something happened to my radio or something happened to the Walkman. Turns out that all of the radio stations that I could get had been knocked off air. So there was just absolutely nothing. There was just nothing but there's no music, no radio coming through my headphones, silence on that end. But I heard a whole bunch of car alarms going off in the distance, and so I walked back into the Creative Arts building at San Francisco State where I attended the class, and the lights were out inside the building. And security people inside the building were starting to evacuate people from the building. They were starting to get people out, and people were busy trying to retrieve things from their lockers before they were ordered out of the building. And I got out of the building probably in about a minute or two and was actually picked up by a family member and driven home. And I remember listening to the Bay Bridge Series game, the World Series game, on the radio, on our car radio, because apparently there was one AM station that was still on. And I just remember how incongruous it was that there was a member of the play-by-play, Giants play-by-play crew that was talking about the baseball game and not about the earthquake at all. So they were, talking as if the game was going to resume in about 5 or 10 minutes and who would pitch and so on and so forth. And it became clear fairly soon that this was bigger than baseball.
How'd you get home?
I was driven home.
What route? Because the Bay Bridge was down.
Oh, well, I lived in the neighborhood. I lived 10 minutes away from San Francisco State. So we just drove up Lake Merced Boulevard into the Sunset District, and we went home. And I remember when I was at home, and I spent the rest of the evening at home in the Sunset District, and our power was out for about maybe 4 or 5 hours. And I remember standing with my mother in front of our house, and it was this eerily quiet, hot day. And I remember standing with my mother out in front of our house, watching a plume of black smoke rise into the sky from the Marina District, and it was visible from where we were, which was kind of amazing. And we were just looking at this plume of smoke rising. So that's pretty much it.
Thank you for listening to this podcast episode, and thank you to those who took part and shared their stories. This episode and all others are available on YouTube, iHeart, and iTunes, as well as anywhere else you listen to podcasts. If there is anything you can take from these stories, it's that living in California comes with an understanding that at any moment the next big one could hit. So do yourself a favor and prepare a kit so that you're ready the next time the big one happens.